The committee will come back to order. Is there any other member wishing to be recognized for an amendment? Chairman. The gentlewoman from the District of Columbia is for what purpose does she seek recognition? How about that?
Mr. Chairman, she seeks recognition because she has an amendment at the desk.
All right. The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr.
The clerk
Chairman,
will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2623, offered by Ms. Norton of the District of Columbia.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read. The gentlewoman from the District of Columbia is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would exempt regulations regarding sexual harassment from this bill, and I think members on both sides will find my amendment especially timely, as Congress is under great criticism to make sure that we eliminate sexual harassment from our own chambers. As you know, Mr. Chairman, the bill would codify the President, that you've put forward, codifies the President's executive orders that require offsetting the number and costs of regulations. That's interesting, since there has been no work to be done on what the implications of these regulations. And before that's done, and before there have been any hearings by this committee, we're already trying to codify it. Last time I looked, we didn't codify things before having hearings on it. So this is a great leap into the unknown. Because this bill, like the President's executive orders, arbitrarily establishes that for every new regulation, two existing, and by the way, potentially unrelated regulations must be repealed. And the costs of any new regulation must be offset by repealing existing regulations that impose a cost of an equal or greater amount. Surely we can agree that it is very difficult. In fact, I would defy any member to tell me what the cost is of some of the sexual harassment we've been hearing about in the Congress and elsewhere. Important rules and regulations that serve to investigate and enforce laws should not be subject to repeal willy-nilly under an arbitrary in and out, one in, two out, or no new costs. Indeed, I thought that what we went through yesterday was a promise. It said everybody went to the bill saying we're on the first step to eliminate sexual harassment from this body with this small step of training and posting. And we were all assured that this was the first step, and we better had been assured, because there's been a public outcry against sexual harassment in the Congress. This increased attention to the number of claims of sexual harassment around the country today, including in the Congress, deserves Congress to do more. And this, the day after we were on the floor unanimously approving the posting and training bill, this first opportunity, we are doing exactly the opposite of what we promised. And that is, instead of doing more to make sure that there is less sexual harassment, we are guaranteeing that we will not be able to undercover much sexual harassment, and that the government is not doing everything possible, as we promised, to rid this body of sexual harassment, certainly arbitrarily repealing rules that serve to provide a workplace free of sexual harassment would go in the opposite direction of what we promised today. So how do we do what this bill is requiring? The costs of new regulations are considered when determining offsets. How do you offset when a woman comes forward or a man comes forward and says, I've been I've been subject to sexual harassment. How would you offset a regulation that allowed that to happen? We know this from the Congressional Research Service, and I'm quoting, measuring costs without also considering benefits does not provide the complete context for evaluating the appropriateness of the country's amount of regulation, end quote. I would think that that goes double and triple for sexual harassment. For example, while we know that there may be costs associated with implementing new rules to deter sexual harassment, I can't think of what they are, but I'm sure there are some. How can we possibly calculate the monetary value of having a workplace free from sexual harassment? This body is going to pay the price for allowing sexual harassment to thrive here, and this bill is going to make it very hard to show we are serious about ridding this body of sexual harassment. I appreciate the committee's consideration of my adoption, and I urge its my amendment, I'm sorry, and I urge its adoption.
I thank the gentlewoman. It is the gentlewoman yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I've been asked, and I ask unanimous consent to add Brenda Lawrence, who wishes to be a co-sponsor of my amendment.
I would like to also be.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair now
Two
recognizes.
other members have asked to be co-sponsors.
So you're asking a unanimous consent?
I am asking unanimous consent.
And those two members are who for the clerk?
I would like to be a co-sponsor.
So could the gentlewoman restate her unanimous consent request?
I ask, Mr. Chairman, that Ms. Maloney and Mr. Lynch be added as co-sponsors.
And Mr. Cummings.
And I ask that Mr. Cummings be added as well.
Robin Kelly.
Without objection, so ordered.
Yes, I'm sorry, who is?
The chair is willing to put all Democrats on as co-sponsors if that's your request.
Thank you for your generosity, Mr. Chairman.
All right, so without objection, all Democrats present are co-sponsors of your amendment. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes in opposition to the gentlewoman's amendment. As the gentlewoman knows, I mean, it was a unified effort to stand against sexual harassment. However, this bill would not prohibit any rulemaking. It actually deals with major rules. And so, you know, the whole premise on which the gentlewoman offers her amendment actually misses the very context of the underlying bill. This amendment that you have provided actually would provide a harmful exemption to the transparency and reform in H.R. 2623 for regulations related to sexual harassment. The amendment would actually also allow agencies to hide changes to sexual harassment regulations by omitting them from the semi-annual unified agenda. And further, the amendment would also prohibit a department from counting its consolidation and updating of sexual harassment regulations across multiple agencies as deregulations. One-off exceptions to this bill, such as this amendment, will not protect those regulations. In fact, I believe it will stagnate them. So now more than ever, we have to ensure that the government has policies to protect federal employees, and therefore I would oppose this amendment, but I appreciate the spirit in which the amendment was offered, and I encourage my colleagues to oppose the amendment. Is there anyone else wishing to speak on the amendment? The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to yield to Ms. Norton to respond to what you just said.
First, I have a parliamentary inquiry. You began by saying, Mr. Chairman, that sexual harassment was not a major rule. In what way?
Would the gentlewoman state her parliamentary inquiry?
Why does the chairman believe that the sexual harassment,
as defined by statute? I mean, well, I don't know that the gentlewoman is expressing a parliamentary inquiry. If the gentlewoman's recognized, if she wants to make a point.
Well, could I simply ask the chairman a question? I want, since it came from you, Mr. Chairman, what did you mean when you said sexual harassment is not a major rule? would not be a major rule. I
The-
took it down, your words.
So would the gentlewoman yield?
I'm
Okay,
glad to hear.
so under statute, when we're looking at this, they have to have an annual effect on the economy of $100 million and more adversely in a material way. And as the gentlewoman knows, that we've had hearings before this particular committee where very substantial regulations do not meet that particular economic threshold. And so that in that, the regulation would actually have to meet a $100 million threshold adversely affecting it. And so that was the context in which I offered that. And so that's, I would yield
Well,
back.
reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman, in that effect, you're essentially saying this does not add to the cost of government, and I'm wondering why this amendment, my amendment that would allow sexual harassment rules and amendments to stand, it being of so little cost. You've also, you found apparently without, and I don't know how you found it, but you found it certainly wouldn't amount to $100 million. And I wonder why it's necessary, therefore, to vote against my amendment.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman, I support this amendment offered by my colleague, Ms. Norton. This amendment would exempt from Section 5 of the bill any rule related to sexual harassment. Under this bill, the Office of Personnel Management, Office of Special Counsel, Department of Defense, or any other agency could be prohibited from issuing a rule to prohibit sexual harassment if the estimated cost of the rule was more than the regulatory budget allocated by the Director of OMB for that year. Sexual harassment is an issue, and we must all take it very seriously. So I urge members to show they take this issue seriously by supporting this amendment. With that, I'll yield back.
Wait a minute.
I yield to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney.
I strongly support my colleague's amendment and the ranking member's statements. And sexual harassment is a crime. It's a serious crime. Often the victims and the perpetrators never recover from the experience. It is a very serious crime, and while the whole nation, for the first time in my life, is taking this crime seriously, this committee is offhandedly dismissing it as something that's not important, should not be included. I think it's an outrage. I think you are a better person than how you're acting now on this amendment. And I hope the chairman will reconsider and support Mrs. Norton's amendment. She is a lawyer who dedicated her life helping people, not before she got elected to Congress, and as in the Office of Equal Employment, protecting them from harassment, from discrimination. She feels deeply and strongly. I admire her work. We should support her. It's important to women across this country today and in the future. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to give this consideration to the women of this country. I yield back to the ranking member.
Yeah, I want to just ask Ms. Norton. Ms. Norton, I take it that it was your intent to try to make sure that we kept rules in place that would affect women in the workplace. Is that right?
Well, that is certainly my intent, and if I may say, Mr. Chairman, we were promised that we were at the beginning of a process. So there may be some rules in place now, but if this bill passes, the Congress will not be able to enact new sexual harassment rules without showing that we're getting rid of two unrelated, perhaps, rules, or costing the government more than $100 million. Mr. I just want to say, part of my concern about this, I think the majority might have been able to enact this rule had it had hearings, but we're voting in the blind on a matter. And I raised this particular amendment because perhaps it's the most sensitive matter the one that is still under advisement by the Congress of the United States, and yet we are nullifying any possibility of new sexual harassment rules and regulations with a vote against my amendment, if we do indeed vote against it.
I see my time has expired. I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman for her heart in this particular issue. I would remind her that workplace requirements and contingencies and rules and regulations are outside the scope of this bill. And when we really look at that, if the desire is for the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia to work for this in a meaningful way, she will find no one more committed to doing that than myself. I will pledge that. If she's willing to withdraw her amendment, here's what I'm willing to do, is to work, and she knows that she can take me at my word. Not only work specifically to make sure that there is no inadvertent adverse effect in this bill as we look at this, but also work individually with the gentlewoman on making sure that we get this addressed for protection across all federal workplaces in the most sincere and direct way. But I offer that to the gentlewoman, and I'm not going to ask her for any comment other than, is there anyone else who would like to speak on the gentlewoman's amendment? Hearing none. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no.
No, and Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. A recorded vote has been called, and so, as previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Does any other member wish to be heard on H.R. 2623? Hearing none? Yes. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I have
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment that has been offered at the desk.
Okay, the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2623, offered by Ms. Plaskett of the Virgin Islands.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read, and the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would exempt laws to protect whistleblowers from H.R. 2623. Whistleblower protections come from several different significant sources. The federal government and many states have laws protecting whistleblowers from retaliation for filing a claim or reporting a violation of law. We must ensure that these laws are not arbitrarily placed on the chopping block as a result of Executive Order 1377-1. This amendment safeguards that. The Federal Clean Air Act, Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation Liability Act, Energy Reorganization Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Solid Waste Disposal Act, Toxic Substance Control Act, and Water Pollution Control Act each contain protections for an employee who complains about safety, health hazards in the workplace, or to the environment caused by an employer. Whistleblower protection laws are important to having policies in place that encourage reporting of wrongdoing to employers and earlier discovery of wrongdoing, which in itself is a cost-saving measure. H.R. 2623 would obstruct vital protections, including those to whistleblowers. These protections are further compromised by the arbitrary requirement that for each new regulation promulgated, 2 existing regulations must be recommended for repeal. Under this requirement, an existing rule that has overwhelming benefits could be identified for repeal solely to meet the statute's cost offset requirement. My colleagues, my Democratic colleagues, and I have consistently worked with the majority to preserve whistleblower protection laws. We cannot have these protections compromised by the Executive Order 13771 or this bill, H.R. 2623. My amendment would exempt from this bill any rule that protects whistleblowers. This bill would jeopardize all agency rulemakings, even those that protect whistleblowers. We must ensure that agencies can issue rules that protect individuals who blow the whistle on waste, fraud, abuse, as well as safety issues that can be a matter of life or death. I strongly recommend that the committee vote to protect whistleblowers and adopt this amendment. I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman. I recognize myself for 5 minutes in opposition to the gentlewoman's amendment. Obviously, she and I have worked together with regards to whistleblower protection. I think she has been part of this committee as we have not only advanced legislation but had hearings where ultimately whistleblower protection, there is not a higher priority that we have for this committee in terms of the whistleblowers. The ranking member and I have not only supported that, but we have been very steadfast in our protection for whistleblowers. As the gentlewoman may know, actually I set up a tell Mark email for whistleblowers that actually came to me. We've had Secret Service agents, we've had federal employees contact me directly. My cell phone somehow got out to a number of federal workers who have let me know of problems, and only as recent as yesterday, a whistleblower had contacted me regarding what they believe is unfair treatment with regards to some of their federal agency workforces. So there is no one who pushes this higher. However, when we take this amendment in this context, again, it's beyond the scope of really what this underlying bill is all about. When we look at these issues, the previous amendment and this amendment, what happens is that the very thing that the gentlewoman seeks to protect by her amendment would actually create a loophole within the law that would allow secrecy to continue to happen. Additionally, it would exclude whistleblower new rules and regulations from the transparency and reform provisions that are in this bill. And so for that reason, obviously, as well as some of the others that have been stated, I would oppose the gentlewoman's amendment, but appreciate the spirit in which it was offered. Is there anyone else wishing to speak on the amendment? The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Yeah, I support the amendment. I wanted to yield to Ms. Plaskett. Did you?
Thank you. I am grateful that you hold in high esteem whistleblower protections. Our concern is, however, that Section 5 requires the Director of OMB to set regulatory budgets for each agency that would include major and non-major rules. A rule can be considered significant by OMB if it represents a major policy change, regardless of the estimated costs. And this section regarding whistleblowers might very well be one of those in which OMB or the Director of OMB is set to include those arbitrary removals. So I understand what you're trying to do by this bill. However, I do believe, as in the previous amendment, there are some areas that we have to carve out protections for so that they do not fall within the capricious nature of whomever is the director of OMB at the time, and that they be removed some of the fundamental attributes that we as members of Congress wish that the agencies would conduct themselves.
Reclaiming my time.
Would the gentleman yield? So again, and because I know the spirit of which the gentlewoman offers this, I want to stress that what we're talking about are major rules and regulations, and so those are that of $100 million or more. And when we look at that, you know, a lot of, whether it's whistleblower protection or any of these others, they wouldn't fall in the context of this. We're talking about major rules and regulations. So the whistleblower example that the gentlewoman referred to would actually be beyond the scope of the underlying bill. But I appreciate the spirit. I yield back, and I thank the gentleman for his courtesy.
No problem. I think this amendment and the other amendment, Mr. Chairman, I think the problem generally is that when we start saying that if you get rid of, if you have one new regulation, then you get rid of two, it is a natural response that you want to make sure that you're just not throwing stuff out, that is very, very significant. Now, we've now talked about two issues, right? Both of which I'm sure that you and I and members of the committee are very sensitive to. And so I don't want us to be left. I heard what you said to Ms. Norton about the first, the sexual harassment amendment. But we want to make sure, and I know you mean every syllable with regard to whistleblowers, because I've had that experience with you. We've seen it, we've done it, we've worked on it. We realize that a lot of our work in this committee is a result of whistleblowers. There's no way we would have been able to make the significant changes that we have made, and we still got work to do with the Secret Service. I mean, I could go on to the various things that whistleblowers have brought to us. And in the climate that we're in now, whistleblowers become even more significant. And not only are they more significant, but I think they are in a situation where they probably would be more reluctant than at other times. So I guess what I'm trying to get to is that I want us to be effective and efficient in whatever we do. And if there are ways that we can make sure that there is nothing in this legislation or that's going to be harmful to our efforts, and we've been doing everything in our power, all of us, to protect these whistleblowers, I think that's the aim. Same thing with sexual harassment, trying to make sure that, you know, when we put out a bill, that we don't inadvertently or, you know, by mistake or whatever, do damage. And I understand what you're saying. You're saying that, you know, we also have to be careful that the amendments don't do further harm. I got that. So I support the amendment, but again, I would hope that you will take the words that I just said in a very, I really mean that. I just want us to try to make sure we protect what we have. My mom used to always tell us, go up the ladder, but don't slip down. So, you know, I want to make sure that we're going in a positive direction, all right?
I appreciate the gentleman, and the gentleman's time's expired, but let me offer this. On the previous amendment and this amendment, certainly it would be the chair's preference that those amendments be withdrawn, but regardless of that, the chair will make a commitment to you to add clarifying language to make sure that both of those issues are addressed in terms of any unintentional consequences within the underlying bill, that it would address those things. I think you know my heart on those. The gentlewoman from New York was gracious enough to acknowledge that. I would certainly encourage a withdrawal of those amendments, but if not, even in spite of that, the chair will make a commitment to the gentlewoman from Virginia, since she's still here, and obviously for the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia to add clarifying language in there. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New York.
Thank you very much for that recognition, and I yield to the gentlelady from Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett.
Thank you. I just had one point of clarification, Mr. Chairman, with regard to a statement that you made that this bill that we are reviewing now, not my amendment, and you discussed that it has only affected significant regulatory action, and that has an annual effect on economy of 100,000 or more, 100 million or more, that you do recognize that there are 4 sections of that significant regulatory action that could be affected. And it's not just the monetary budget that with which any regulatory action could be taken. I yield.
Oh, I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman. Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Hearing none, the question is now on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. The amendment is
Mr.
not
Chair,
agreed to.
I would request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is ordered. As previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Is there any other member wishing to be heard? The gentleman, for what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurthy, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2623, offered by Mr. Krishnamurthy of Illinois.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The legislation we are, in my humble opinion, debating today is an arbitrary attempt at deregulation. By codifying the requirement that agencies must identify 2 rules to repeal before proposing a new one, this legislation potentially endangers rules and regulations that serve to protect our environment, our constituents' financial security, and, yes, our national security as well. I'm particularly concerned about the potential impact this legislation would have on future efforts to strengthen the process by which security clearances are processed and granted. This is why my amendment would exempt from the underlying bill any rule related to the process for obtaining or retaining a security clearance. As we've seen recently, senior White House advisor Jared Kushner submitted 4 addendums to his paperwork after his original forms contained more than 100 errors and omissions. When asked by this committee about the sheer extent of the errors, the director of the National Background Investigations Bureau stated that he had never seen that level of error. Former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn failed to disclose over $65,000 in payments from companies linked to both the Russian government and the periodical Russia Today. He also did not register as a foreign agent after accepting a $600,000 contract to lobby on behalf of Erdogan and Putin. If I may quote the former chairman of this committee, quote unquote, "As a former military officer, you simply cannot take money from Russia, Turkey, or anybody else, and it appears as if he did take that money. It was inappropriate, and there are repercussions for a violation of law." Despite these blatant omissions from his security clearance paperwork, Mr. Flynn was able to obtain a security clearance to serve as National Security Advisor for 24 days before his resignation. My amendment protects rules that strengthen our security clearance process and ensure that the NBIB is not forced to arbitrarily roll back rules that protect the integrity of the security clearance process. By exempting security clearances, we are providing OPM the flexibility to strengthen how security clearances are provided and retained and ensure that only the most qualified and trustworthy officials receive them. Our national secrets are at stake. Lives are at stake. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back.
I appreciate the gentleman's amendment. I recognize myself for 5 minutes, unfortunately, in opposition to the gentleman's amendment. I know that it comes as a shock to the gentleman from Illinois, and anybody with that kind of smile is very hard to obviously oppose for many of the same reasons that I have presented on the other amendments. And surprisingly, all these amendments look exactly alike except for just one little part that's changed. But I will say that in doing that, for many of the same reasons that I've reinforced, my commitment to make sure that security clearances are not affected actually probably doesn't get applied to the same offer that I've made the gentlewoman from Virginia and the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia. But as the gentleman knows that in the chairman over OPM and all that, security clearance has been here. You've actually been the ranking member as we've had some of these these hearings, and he knows that I will deal with him in a fair way. If there's some language that can be added as a clarification, I certainly would welcome his input. We'll try to make that as a part of any technical changes that we have, but in doing that, I'm afraid I have to oppose the amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same. Is there anyone else wishing to speak on the amendment? Since I have a few minutes left, and I guess the gentleman wants, the chair will yield the balance of his time to the gentleman from Illinois for a retort.
May I have colloquy with you, Mr. Chairman?
Certainly. The gentleman from Illinois, this is always a disadvantage when I get an esteemed individual from Illinois and you've got just I have no debate skills, so let's go ahead and try that. How about that?
That's very disarming, but slightly inaccurate. Let me just ask you a question. Is it your belief that this rule that basically requires that any new regulation that may be used to enhance our national security by, for instance, strengthening the rules with regard to the security clearance process would require that 2 regulations be removed in
no,
that same sphere?
And that's a very valid question, and that's really the premise behind this is to not hamper the way that our federal agencies are able to do rules, and those rules that many times appear in the Federal Registry on a day-to-day basis in terms of being able to be more efficient, as the ranking member has talked about, and effective in what we do. It is really designed as those major rules that, just to be honest, what happens is laws get passed 20 years ago, and we're still making major rules and regulations as it relates to a Congress that may have been here 2 decades before. And it's not actually carrying out the intent of Congress, and it's only on those major applications. I do not see in any way that this bill would stop OPM, and now it appears DOD from allowing for additional security clearance measures for our national security point. Certainly not the intent. We will be glad to go back through that, but I can tell you as we were drafting it, it was not the intent, and those would be excluded.
So I understand. May I?
Sure. I think we still have 45 seconds for you to make one great final point.
If the chairman were in charge of implementing these rules, perhaps I would be a little more confident that the intention behind these rules would be effectuated.
That is a disarming statement. I appreciate the gentleman.
We can't assure that someone of your character would be implementing these rules, or someone of your integrity would be there. And so that's why I think it's so important to protect the integrity of the process and to make sure that the intention is carried out by exempting this particular area of the law from, these regulations, this particular overall set of rules that you're trying to put in place.
So I will say that as is in the clarifying statement, I think what we will be able to do is to hopefully address the issue that the gentleman from Illinois raises. National security is a priority for him and me, and so as we look at that, it is my belief, my strong belief, that it would not hamper us from doing additional rules and guidance that would do that, but we'll be glad to take a second look at it, and I appreciate the gentleman's kind and what we would say in the South, genteel manner in being able to go back and forth.
Well, thank you, and I do want a recorded vote.
Well, hold on. We haven't defeated it yet.
Clear. I just want to make that clear.
We can skip that part, huh? All right. Well, the gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
When you got the votes, you got the votes. You understand that, right? Anyway. Just want to say I support the gentleman's amendment, and I appreciate what you said, Mr. Chairman, with regard to trying to do your best to you know, that you, first of all, that you listen to what I said and that you want to try to work things out as best you can. You know, it's easy to, sometimes in this space of Congress, we can get to a point where we have all or nothing. And I think if we can find ways that we can still reach the same goals that we're trying to reach, or at least part of them, then I think that's a good thing. Certainly, you know, I would love to see the amendment go through, but I'm a realist. I tell you, when I was in the hospital for 60 days this summer, it made me realize you better use every opportunity you get to accomplish the things that you want to accomplish, because life is like being in a basketball game where the clock is covered, but you can hear it ticking, and at any moment, it's going to stop ticking and talking. And so the question is, what do you get done, and what do you leave? What difference do you make? Do you waste your time? Because time is valuable, and so I'm hoping, in that spirit, that we'll be able to make sure that we get what we can done. I know there's going to be disagreement. I know that there are technical arguments that are valid, but on the other hand, there are ways to make sure that we put the language in which hopefully will protect some of the concerns of all of our members. And by the way, it's probably not just Democrats. It's Republicans, I'm sure, are concerned too. They want clear language so that people are not reading things into the legislation that are not accurate or questioning exactly what we meant. So anyway, with that, I support the gentleman's amendment, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I also want to congratulate the gentleman on his recent bill that was signed into law, where he actually went to work on behalf of the federal workforce to make sure that they had some flexibility with regards to their thrift saving plan. Congratulations, and I appreciate his forethought on that. Does anybody else wish to speak on the amendment by the gentleman from Illinois? All right, hearing none. If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye. Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it.
Yes, I want to record.
I assume that a recorded vote would be requested, so the recorded vote is ordered as previously announced. The proceeding on the question will be postponed. Is there anyone else wishing to seek recognition? All right, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. A recorded vote is ordered, so as previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 4431. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 4431 to amend Title V United States Code to provide for interest payments by agencies in the case of administrative error in processing certain annuity deposits for prior military service.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia and an original co-sponsor of the bill, Mr. Heiss, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Members of the military who become federal civilian employees upon the completion of their military service may voluntarily elect to pay a military service deposit. This deposit is paid into the pension fund for federal employees. Payment of a deposit allows time in the military to be counted toward pension eligibility. It also allows an individual to increase the amount of his or her pension upon retirement by counting creditable military service in the annuity calculation. If an individual chooses to pay a military service deposit, the individual must do so prior to retirement from federal civilian service. The individual must also pay the deposit within 2 years of starting civilian service if he or she wishes to avoid paying interest on a deposit. On the 3rd anniversary of a civilian employment, interest will accrue annually until the deposit is paid in full. Representative Buddy Carter, a former member of this committee, had a constituent who actually had to pay a military service deposit. The constituent was told by his employing agency prior to retiring that his military service deposit had been paid in full. Upon retirement, however, the Office of Personnel Management rejected his military service department on his retirement application because his employing agency incorrectly calculated the amount he initially owed. The constituent was given the opportunity to pay the correct amount. However, because his military service deposit was roughly 13 years earlier, the constituent now owed nearly $30,000 in interest, and after appealing the ruling, fortunately the constituent in this case was able to get the employing agency to pay the interest that had accrued as a result of the agency's mistake. This particular constituent was fortunate, however, that his agency was able to do so. In nearly an identical case from 1996, the GAO found the Department of Energy could not make a similar payment to cover the accrued interest, despite the fact that it was the agency's mistake in the first place. GOA stated that the Department of Energy has not pointed to any specific authorization for it to pay the interest due to agency error, and we are not aware of any. Accordingly, the appropriated funds of DOE are not available to remedy the consequences of this erroneous calculation. So in this case, the employee was required to pay the full amount of the deposit plus accrued interest to receive retirement credit for his military service. This bill that we are looking at, H.R. 4431, addresses this problem by expressly authorizing all agencies to pay any interest accrued on military service deposits as a result of agency administrative errors. We want to make sure that federal workers with prior military service who follow the rules are not unfairly penalized. And so I, Mr. Chairman, want to commend my friend from Georgia for introducing this important legislation. And I hope and urge all my colleagues will join me in supporting this bill. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his leadership and his insight on the bill. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes on a statement on the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I thank Representative Carter and our other colleagues on the committee for their sponsorship of this bipartisan bill. This measure would authorize agencies to pay interest on military service deposits in cases in which the administrative error causes interest to be due. Military service members who transition to civilian service may elect to have past military service factored into their federal civilian pensions by making deposits or payments to the Civilian Retirement Fund. These payments are intended to align with the contribution to the pension fund the employees would have made for the years of service they are credited with for military service. Current law requires these payments to be paid within 2 years of starting civilian service. After this date, interest is assessed on any outstanding payments. Sometimes agencies make mistakes calculating the deposit amount that is due. In these cases, it is only fair that agencies that made the error should pay the accrued interest. Under current law or regulation, not all agencies have the authority to pay such accrued interest. The bill will close this significant loophole. I think the legislation would be improved by making similar changes to the parallel provisions in Title V regarding deposits for VISTA and Peace Corps services. I will offer an amendment to the effect a little later, and I urge my colleagues to support both the bill and the amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his comments. Does any other member wish to be heard? Gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to thank our colleague, Representative Carter, for bringing this bill to all of our attention, because it does fix a problem through no fault of the veteran. The general public looks at military service and time that would be served of adding those years to later government service as somehow some perk, or even some calling it some double dipping or something of that nature. But the reality is, time spent in the military under 20 years of service bears no retirement benefit whatsoever. Nothing is paid in, nothing can be taken out. And so the laws allow these payments where people have served in the military to buy the retirement, as my friend from Maryland has astutely pointed out, that it would have been the money they would have put in equal, or in some cases, far more equal government service to the military. And so after these years of service, often in battle, now these members can be properly rewarded, and penalizing the agency that made the error rather than the veteran is just the right thing to do. And so I applaud our colleague, Representative Carter, and also thank my friend, Representative Heiss, for bringing this to the committee. It's just good government, and it's the right thing to do. And I urge my colleagues to support.
I thank the gentleman from Oklahoma. Is there any other member wishing to be heard? The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank Representative Carter for his good work on this bill. I'm a co-sponsor along with Mr. Welch, the gentleman from Vermont. We ask far too much sacrifice from those men and women who decide to serve this country. We have an all-volunteer military in this country, and too often we don't do enough to repay and respect the service that is rendered. And so I think this is, I thank Mr. Heiss again for bringing this to the committee. I thank Mr. Russell for his remarks as well. He certainly knows full well the sacrifice involved in lengthy service to the military. And I think this is the right thing to do, and I'm glad that this is going forward in a bipartisan manner, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Is there any other member wishing to be heard?
I have an amendment.
All right. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, seek recognition?
Amendment of the desk. I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
The clerk will designate their amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4431 offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
And without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
I want to reiterate the fact that I think this is a great bill. And so, Mr. Chairman, like military service, volunteer service in the Peace Corps and VISTA can also be factored into the calculation of a federal civilian pension. My amendment would provide the Office of Personnel Management, which is responsible for calculating VISTA and Peace Corps service deposit amounts, with the authority to pay accrued interest if it makes an error. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I want to associate myself with everything that has been said so far, and particularly what Mr. Lynch was just saying with regard to how we treat our veterans. And one of the things, Mr. Chairman, that I became very much familiar with when I served as the ranking member of the Benghazi Select Committee was that whole concept of soft power and how important it is that we have missionaries going out into some very difficult circumstances in countries in many instances, but doing good things and basically helping to keep peace, improving and enhancing the image of our country all over the world. And when you look at these Peace Corps and VISTA workers, I think they fall into the same category with regard to this whole question of the same issues that we're dealing with regard to veterans. And so what this amendment does is just add them so that they too can take advantage of what is, I think, a very good bill and a good opportunity. And so, with that, I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his recognition of the underlying bill and certainly the intent of this amendment. Is there any member wishing to speak on the amendment? The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member for his comments as well. Under current law, federal civilian employees who have performed volunteer service in the Peace Corps or Americorps can pay to have their service counted for the purposes of computing an annuity, and this is calculated by the Office of Personnel Management. If that deposit is late or if the amount of the deposit is too small, interest is assessed. This amendment being presented would authorize OPM to pay that interest if the underpayment or late payment was caused by the agency's administrative error in the first place. Again, I want to thank the ranking member for bringing this situation to our attention, the possibility of the Peace Corps and Americorps volunteers being potentially exposed to the same problem that we are trying to solve for our former military personnel. It's a good observation and indeed a possible problem that I believe deserves our attention, and we should explore the best ways to handle this situation, and I certainly appreciate the intent of this amendment. But I also believe that we need additional time to fully understand whether we can address this issue for volunteers in the same way that we address it for our military personnel. We're committed, I would like to say, to the ranking member and the minority to find a solution to this problem, and we'll continue to work with them on this bill before it goes to the floor in order to resolve this. But for now, I would recommend a no on the amendment, but again, would like to make clear for the record that we will examine the issue more closely and in a bipartisan way. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
I think the gentleman from Maryland, will you yield to the gentleman from Maryland?
So I want to thank the gentleman for yielding, and I accept what you just said. And it goes back to what I've been saying today, just trying to come up with, just meaningful solutions to issues. And I'm glad that you, too, recognize that significance of soft power, because, I think a lot of people don't seem to realize how significant that service is and how, while we want a strong military, of course, but we also, I'm sure most of us would agree, that we can avoid having to use those weapons. We want to do that, and we want to create goodwill. We want to create goodwill wherever we are. So I will, in light of what you just said, and Chairman said to me that he would be working with us, with that I will withdraw the amendment. And again, I want to thank you.
I thank the gentleman, and and I,
Yield any list-
Oh,
uh,
I yield to the gentleman.
okay, well, you can yield back to the
I'm
gentleman,
sorry.
and
Yeah,
will
yeah,
you
I
yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts? Yeah,
sure.
the gentleman from Massachusetts has got 1 minute and 34 seconds left.
Well, thank you, sir. I won't use that all, but, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the courtesy. I just want to be on the record as saying I would have voted in favor of the gentleman's amendment. I had a chance last year to visit some of our Peace Corps volunteers in Tanzania, young women, barely 20 years old, out there, hundreds of miles from any utilities for the sole purpose of working on behalf of this country, reducing the risk of AIDS to some of the tribes in Africa. And that is noble service. And when an agency of the government fouls up somebody's pension, whether they are in uniform or whether they are rendering some other service on behalf of this country, I think we have a duty to straighten it out. So I do respect the gentleman's control over his own amendment, and I do endorse the accommodation that's being made here, and I yield back whatever time I have left. Thank you.
Okay, yields back to the gentleman. Will the gentleman recognize the gentleman from Maryland? All right.
First of all, I want to thank you, Mr. Lynch, for what you just said. I do think we can work this out. I believe in Mr. Carter and certainly Mr. Meadows, the chairman, and I think we can get something done because I think we're all in agreement on that these folks deserve the benefit of the kinds of things we're trying to do in this bill. And that's the only reason that I withdrew it, because, again, I want to get something done at the end of the day, and that's where I stand. But thank you very much.
I thank the gentleman. I thank the gentleman for his courtesy. I will say this to the ranking member and the gentleman from Massachusetts. I'm optimistic that we'll be able to find some language. Just in truth, there needs to be a little bit more due diligence on our side to make sure we're not doing anything inadvertent. But I think the premise, both the gentleman from Georgia and I support, and I'm very optimistic that we'll find something that'll be satisfactory. Are there any other amendments on this this bill? All right. Hearing none, the question would be on. Okay, so the amendment is drawn. Does any other member wish to be heard? All right, the question is on favorably reporting H.R. 4431 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. 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 Any opposed? In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purposes? The gentleman from Alabama seek recognition.
I request permission to speak out of order on H.R. 2623.
Okay, the gentleman is recognized.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the dialogue and that we have had on this bill, and particularly in respect to the amendments that have been offered. But what I want to point out, and I pointed this out in a hearing that we had yesterday, that this is really one of these areas where we shouldn't be making it political. We need to look at how we improve the quality of service that we provide the American people through the regulatory process. And we earlier had a hearing in which we had a gentleman from the United Kingdom, Jatinder Kohli, testify about how this has positively impacted things in the United Kingdom. They started out with an effort where for every new regulation that they added, they removed one. They have now gone to 1 in, 3 out. It saved British businesses and British consumers £6.5 billion. That's about $10 billion in U.S. dollars. And it has worked so well that now Australia and Canada are looking at that. I think what your bill is trying to do is absolutely a step in the right direction. I commend you for introducing it, and I really would like to look forward to the opportunity to work with other members in this entire committee to improve what we're trying to do in terms of regulation making, so that we're actually doing something that benefits the American public. As I pointed out in the hearing yesterday, if you look at the regulatory burden that's imposed on the U.S. economy, it's about $1.9 trillion. That's about $15,000 per household. It has a disproportionately heavy burden on low-income families. I grew up in a low-income family, so this really hits home with me. And I just, my main point, sir, is that we stay focused on doing what's best for the American economy and for the American household. With that, sir, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his comments and certainly for his interest in regulatory reform. The committee will now consider the following postal namings bills on block: H.R. 3638, H.R. 3655, H.R. 4042, H.R. 4285, and H.R. 4301. I ask unanimous consent that the bills be ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. And so without objection, so ordered. So we are going to go ahead and go to recess at this particular point. We will reconvene for roll call votes after a consultation with the ranking member for a convenient time for all of the committee. So the committee stands in recess.